Parents demanded I empty my accounts for sister's $300,000 debt after erasing me 5 years ago. I said no, so they ravaged the property with baseball bats. But they didn't know the house was. I am 33 years old, and for a long time, I genuinely believed I had finally outrun the shadows of my past. I work as a senior software engineer for a tech firm that lets me work entirely remotely, which means my home is my absolute sanctuary. It is a beautiful, sprawling property in a quiet suburban neighborhood, far away from the noise and chaos of the city. I bought this house entirely on my own. I saved every single penny, skipped vacations, lived on cheap noodles in my 20s, and poured all my energy into building a life that nobody could ever take away from me. Walking across the polished hardwood floors, feeling the morning sunlight stream through the custom bay windows I had just installed, I felt a deep, profound sense of peace. Things were going incredibly well. My career was thriving, and my personal life was better than I ever thought it could be. I had been dating an amazing man named Cameron for over a year. He lived a state away in Colorado, so we were doing the whole long-distance thing, but it worked beautifully. We talked every night. He was the kind of partner who actually listened, who celebrated my wins instead of getting intimidated by them. We were already discussing the very real possibility of me selling my house, packing up my life, and moving across state lines so we could finally close the gap and start a real life together. I felt safe. I felt secure. Then came a completely unremarkable Tuesday morning. I was sitting at my home office desk, sipping a fresh cup of coffee, staring at lines of code on my dual monitors. The house was perfectly quiet, just the way I like it. Suddenly, a notification sound chimed through my speakers. It was a ping from my old, discarded email account, the one I had abandoned years ago and only kept logged in on a background browser just in case. I almost ignored it. But curiosity got the better of me, so I clicked over to the tab. The moment my eyes registered the sender's name, the hot coffee in my stomach suddenly felt like a block of ice. The sender was Diane, my mother. I had not spoken a single word to my mother, my father, or my older sister in 5 long years. 5 years of absolute, deafening silence. My hands actually started to shake as I hovered my mouse over the subject line. It read, "Urgent. Life or death. Please come home." That was it. Just those few words. But they were enough to completely derail my peaceful morning. My heart started hammering against my ribs. Life or death. What did that mean? For 5 years, they had treated me like I was a ghost, like I had died and been buried and forgotten. To reach out now, to an old email address they must have dug up from some ancient digital archive, meant something catastrophic had happened. I sat back in my expensive, ergonomic office chair and stared at the ceiling. The sanctuary I had built around myself suddenly felt very fragile. The past was knocking on my front door, and it was demanding to be let in. To understand why a single email from my mother sent me into a spiral of anxiety, you have to understand the family I grew up in. I was raised in a household where love was not unconditional. Love was a currency, and my older sister, Sabrina, held the monopoly on it. Sabrina is 36 now, 3 years older than me. Growing up, she was the undisputed center of the universe in our home. If Sabrina wanted something, Sabrina got it. It did not matter if we could afford it, and it certainly did not matter if I had to sacrifice something I needed so she could have what she wanted. When Sabrina turned 16, my parents, Diane and Richard, bought her a brand new car because they said she needed to feel independent. When I turned 16, I was handed a bus pass and told that building character through public transportation was good for me. My parents always had an excuse for the blatant favoritism. Sabrina was a free spirit. Sabrina was sensitive. Sabrina had a delicate artistic soul that needed nurturing, while I was the pragmatic, boring child who could handle disappointment. When she failed her college classes because she spent all her time partying, they paid for her to retake them, blaming the professors for being too strict. When I graduated at the top of my class with a degree in computer science, having worked 2 part-time jobs to avoid taking out crushing student loans, my father just gave me a brief nod and said that was what was expected of me. Then Sabrina met Trent. Trent became my brother-in-law, and he was the perfect match for her in the absolute worst way possible. He was a slick, fast-talking guy who wore suits that were a little too shiny and talked endlessly about his big investments and grand visions. He had expensive tastes, but no actual wealth to back them up, completely feeding into Sabrina's massive ego and her delusion that she was destined to be part of the elite upper class. Living in the shadow of the golden child taught me a very harsh lesson very early on. Nobody was coming to save me. Nobody was going to hand me a safety net. If I fell, I would hit the concrete. That realization forged me into an absolute workaholic. I hoarded money like a dragon hoarding gold. Every paycheck I earned, I lived on a tiny fraction of it and locked the rest away in high-yield savings accounts and index funds. My bank account balance was not just numbers on a screen, it was my armor. It was my literal escape hatch from a family that viewed me entirely as a background character in the movie of Sabrina's life. They viewed my financial stability not with pride, but with a strange, entitled resentment. They saw my disciplined lifestyle as me being cheap and selfish, while they saw Sabrina's reckless spending as her just living life to the fullest. They never understood why I refused to lend her money when she maxed out her credit cards buying designer handbags. I was the difficult child. I was the cold, unfeeling sister. And 5 years ago, that dynamic finally reached its explosive breaking point. I remember the night everything shattered with absolute clarity. I was 28 years old, living in a cramped, drafty one-bedroom apartment in the city. The heating barely worked, the neighbors were loud, and the plumbing constantly rattled, but I didn't care. I didn't care because I had just hit a massive milestone. Through years of grinding, skipping vacations, and working insane overtime hours, I had saved exactly $120,000. It was going to be the down payment on my future. It was my ticket out of the struggle. It was a Saturday evening, the night of our mandatory weekly family dinner at my parents' house. The smell of lemon polish and stale tension hung in the air, just like it always did. We were sitting around the dining table, my parents, Sabrina, Trent, and me. The moment I sat down, I could tell something was off. Sabrina was practically vibrating with nervous excitement, and my mother kept shooting her these proud, encouraging smiles. Halfway through the meal, Sabrina cleared her throat and announced she was finally starting her own business. She used a lot of vague, corporate buzzwords. It was going to be a luxury lifestyle consultancy firm, whatever that meant. She talked about office space in the high-end district, marketing budgets, and hiring assistants. Then, the room went completely silent. All 4 of them turned to look at me. Sabrina put on her sweetest, most manipulative voice and said she needed seed money. She said she knew I had over $100,000 sitting around doing nothing. She proposed that I give her my entire life savings, $120,000, as an investment in her brilliant idea. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline. When I realized she was dead serious, I laughed out loud. I told her absolutely not. I reminded her that she had already failed at 3 different multi-level marketing schemes and had never held down a real job for more than a year. I told her that money was for my house, my future, and I was not setting it on fire to fund her delusions of grandeur. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. Sabrina burst into hysterical, dramatic tears, burying her face in Trent's shoulder. Trent glared at me like I had just kicked a puppy. My mother started screaming, calling me a selfish, greedy, jealous monster who could not stand to see her sister succeed. But it was my father, Richard, who delivered the final blow. He stood up, slammed his hands on the table, and looked at me with eyes so cold I felt it in my bones. He told me that family helps family. He delivered an absolute ultimatum. He said, and I will never forget his exact words, "You give your sister that money right now, or you walk out that door and you are no longer a part of this family. You are dead to us." I looked at the people who were supposed to love and protect me. They were all staring back with sheer, entitled hostility. So, I stood up, grabbed my coat, and walked out into the freezing night. I cried the entire drive back to my tiny apartment, mourning the family I wished I had. The very next day, I changed my phone number. I blocked their social media. I walked away and focused entirely on myself. I used that money to buy my beautiful house, and I never looked back. Until that Tuesday morning, 5 years later, when my mother's email landed in my inbox. I spent hours staring at that short, desperate email. Urgent. Life or death. Please come home. Part of me wanted to delete it, empty the trash folder, and go make myself a sandwich. They had made their choice 5 years ago, and I had made mine. But the rational, empathetic part of my brain would not let it go. What if Richard had suffered a massive stroke? What if Diane was in the late stages of terminal cancer? I hated them for what they did to me, but I knew that if one of them was literally lying on their deathbed, I would regret it for the rest of my life if I did not at least show up to hear them out. I sent a brief, cold reply saying I would drive down on Saturday morning. The 2-hour drive back to my hometown was pure psychological torture. I had the radio playing, but I couldn't hear the music over the sound of my own racing thoughts. My knuckles were practically white from gripping the steering wheel so hard. I kept running through every tragic medical scenario in my head, mentally preparing myself for the smell of a hospice bed or the sight of an oxygen tank. But when I finally turned onto my parents' familiar suburban street and pulled up to the driveway, all of my anxiety instantly evaporated. It was immediately replaced by a hot, bitter wave of suspicion and disgust. There was no ambulance. There was no wheelchair ramp. Instead, parked right in the middle of the driveway, gleaming under the morning sun, were 2 absolutely pristine, late-model luxury vehicles. One was a sleek black Mercedes sedan, and the other was a massive, fully loaded white Range Rover. Both looked like they had just rolled straight off the dealership floor. I parked my modest, reliable sedan on the curb and just sat there for a minute, staring at those cars. My heart rate slowed down and my jaw clenched tight. Nobody who is dealing with a terminal illness or a life-shattering medical bankruptcy drives a brand new Range Rover to a family emergency meeting. I knew, with absolute certainty, before my foot even touched the pavement, that I had been tricked. This was not a medical crisis. This was a financial ambush. I took a deep breath, grabbed my purse, and marched up the front walkway. I didn't bother knocking gently. I pressed the doorbell and held it down until I heard footsteps inside. The door swung open, and there stood my mother. Diane looked older, her face lined with stress, but she still carried that same arrogant, manipulative aura she always had. She tried to reach out and hug me, pulling up a fake, teary smile, but I stepped back, refusing the contact. I told her I was only here because she said someone was dying. She swallowed hard, her fake smile faltering, and stepped aside to let me in. I walked into the living room, and the scene waiting for me was like a perfectly staged theatrical play of misery. The living room smelled exactly the same, but the atmosphere was suffocating. My father, Richard, was sitting in his usual armchair, looking grim and defensive. On the sofa sat Sabrina and Trent. Sabrina looked like a complete wreck. Her designer makeup was smeared under her eyes, and she was clutching a crumpled tissue, sobbing theatrically. Trent sat next to her, pale and staring at the floor, completely lacking his usual slick confidence. I did not sit down. I stood in the center of the room, crossed my arms, and demanded to know who was dying. My father cleared his throat, avoiding my eyes. He said nobody was dying of a disease, but Sabrina's life was in grave danger. He said her business venture had collapsed, and now she was in deep trouble. I felt a dark, vindictive smirk try to form on my face, but I fought it down. I wanted to scream, "I told you so," at the top of my lungs. I wanted to remind them of the $120,000 they demanded I throw into her black hole of a business. Instead, I just asked casually how much she owed the bank. Sabrina let out a loud, pathetic wail. Trent finally spoke up, his voice cracking. He said it was not a bank. He said Sabrina did not just take out a bad business loan. She had taken money from private investors, massive sums of money, promising them huge returns on a luxury real estate flipping scheme that never actually existed. She had taken their investment funds and used them to buy the Mercedes, the Range Rover, first-class vacations to Europe, and a closet full of designer clothes to maintain the illusion of success. It wasn't a failed business. It was a Ponzi scheme. It was outright, textbook financial fraud. My jaw practically hit the floor as the reality of the situation washed over me. I asked exactly how much money she had stolen. Sabrina whispered through her tears that the total debt was $300,000. $300,000. Trent nervously added that these investors were not the kind of people who sent polite letters from lawyers. He claimed they were dangerous, shadowy figures. He said these people had been calling their phones, driving past their luxury apartment, and making severe physical threats. He spun this wild, terrifying narrative about violent loan sharks who were going to break their legs or worse if they did not hand over the $300,000 by the end of the month. I stood there, processing the sheer scale of the disaster. My sister was not just a spoiled brat anymore. She was a white-collar criminal who had swindled $300,000 to fund a fake billionaire lifestyle. And now, supposedly, the criminal underworld was knocking on her door to collect. I looked at my parents. They looked terrified, completely absorbed in the panic of the situation. I felt a fleeting moment of pity for them, followed immediately by a wall of cold, hard logic. I told them that this was a terrible situation, and I suggested they call the FBI or the police if violent criminals were threatening them. But my mother stepped forward, wiping her dry eyes, and finally revealed the real reason I had been summoned. Diane looked me dead in the eye and said the police could not help them, but I could. She spoke with this sickeningly sweet, totally detached tone, as if she were asking me to pass the salt at dinner. She said they had been keeping tabs on me from afar. They knew I had a high-paying job. They knew I had bought a massive, beautiful estate in the suburbs. She said, without a single ounce of shame, that the solution to this whole nightmare was simple. I just needed to sell my house, empty out my savings accounts, and give them the $300,000 to pay off Sabrina's dangerous investors. I literally lost my breath for a second. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of the request paralyzed me. I asked her to repeat herself, hoping I had hallucinated the whole thing. She did. She actually doubled down. Diane took a step closer and told me that I was young, smart, and single. She said I could easily start over, rent a small apartment for a few years, and rebuild my wealth. She pointed a shaking finger at Sabrina, who was weeping loudly, and said, "Your sister is going to be murdered or thrown in federal prison. Family helps family. You have to save her." I didn't yell. I didn't scream or throw a tantrum. Instead, an icy calm washed over my entire body. I looked at the four of them, these strangers tied to me by blood, and I let out a low, bitter laugh. I looked directly at my father and reminded him of his exact words from 5 years ago. I reminded him that he looked me in the face and told me I was dead to them because I wouldn't hand over my money. I told them that they erased me from their lives. They threw me out into the cold so they could play pretend with their golden child. I pointed at the window toward the driveway. I told them if they needed $300,000, they could start by selling the Mercedes and the Range Rover. They could sell my parents' house. They could sell Trent's expensive watches. I told them I would not give them a single red cent, let alone sell my sanctuary to fund a criminal's bailout. Richard's face turned purple with rage. He stood up, pointing a thick finger at me, roaring that I was a heartless, evil disappointment. He swore that if anything happened to Sabrina, her blood would be entirely on my hands. He promised me that I would regret turning my back on my own flesh and blood. I looked at him, completely unfazed by his manufactured rage. I told him that I did not have a family, and I turned around and walked out the front door. I got into my car, locked the doors, and drove away. I felt a massive sense of finality. The cord was cut. But as I merged onto the highway to head back to my peaceful home, I had no idea that the real nightmare had not even begun yet. They were not going to let me go that easily. Before we get to the insane revenge and the massive karma that destroyed their lives, please take a second to hit the like button on this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment down below with the name of the city you are watching from. Every single comment helps this video reach more people, and I truly appreciate your support. Now let's get back to the story, because what they did next was absolutely unhinged. For a few days after I drove away from my parents' house, I existed in a state of hypervigilance. Every time a car drove past my window a little too slowly, my heart would jump into my throat. Every time my phone buzzed with an unknown number, a cold sweat would break out across the back of my neck. But as the days turned into a week, the silence stretched on. There were no more emails from Diane. There were no unhinged voicemails from Richard. Slowly, my nervous system began to regulate itself. I started to believe that my harsh dose of reality had actually worked. I convinced myself that they had finally realized I was a fortress they could not breach, and they had moved on to figure out their own mess. I was so incredibly wrong. It was a Thursday afternoon. The weather was crisp and sunny, and I was in my kitchen, preparing a late lunch while listening to a podcast. I had my laptop open on the granite island, casually scrolling through some work emails. I felt safe. My house was tucked away at the end of a cul-de-sac, in a neighborhood where people kept to themselves. My address was not publicly listed anywhere on the internet. I had made sure of that when I bought the property, deliberately using a privacy trust to keep my name off the county's public property records. I was slicing an apple when I heard the distinct sound of car doors slamming shut. It was right outside my front door. I froze, the knife hovering in the air. I told myself it was just a delivery driver. I put the knife down and walked over to the front window, peeling back the edge of the blinds just a fraction of an inch to peek outside. My stomach plummeted so fast I felt physically sick. Standing in my driveway, looking up at my beautiful, hard-earned home with expressions of calculating greed, were my mother and father. Panic hit me like a physical blow. My mind raced, trying to figure out the impossible logistics. How did they find me? I had never told them what city I moved to, let alone my exact street address. Before I could process the shock, the doorbell rang. It didn't just ring once. It rang 3 times in rapid succession, followed by the heavy, authoritative thud of my father's fist pounding against the solid wood of my front door. I realized in that moment that ignoring them was not an option. They knew I worked from home. They knew I was inside. If I didn't answer, they would just keep escalating. I took a deep breath, marched to the front door, unlocked the deadbolt, and ripped the door open, blocking the threshold with my body. I demanded to know how they found my house. Diane did not even look apologetic. She actually looked smug. She puffed out her chest and informed me, with a frightening level of pride, that they had hired a private investigator. She said it cost them a small fortune, but family emergencies required drastic measures. A private investigator. My own parents had hired a professional stranger to hunt me down like I was a fugitive skipping out on bail. The sheer, violating horror of that fact left me speechless for a split second. And in that split second of hesitation, they made their move. Richard shoved his shoulder against the door, pushing past me with brute force, and Diane followed right behind him, slipping into my hallway like a shadow. I spun around, shouting at them to get out, but they completely ignored me. They were already walking deeper into my house, their eyes darting around, taking inventory of my life. Watching them roam around my living room was one of the most surreal and violating experiences of my life. They were touching my things. Diane ran her hand over the back of my expensive leather sofa. Richard stared up at the high-vaulted ceilings and nodded to himself, clearly running mental calculations on the square footage and the market value of the property. They were not looking at my home as a place where their daughter lived. They were looking at it as an asset to be liquidated for their favorite child. I stepped into the center of the room and pointed directly at the front door. I kept my voice dangerously low and steady, telling them they had exactly 1 minute to turn around and walk out before I called the police for trespassing. Diane immediately deployed her favorite weapon. She collapsed onto my sofa, buried her face in her hands, and started wailing. It was a loud, theatrical sob that filled the entire room. She cried out that Sabrina was terrified, that the investors had given them a final deadline, and that I was the only one who could stop her from going to prison. She begged me to look around at all this luxury I had and realize that I didn't need it. She said a single woman didn't need a 4-bedroom house. She said I could sell it, give them the $300,000, and buy myself a nice little condo with whatever was left over. I stared at her, feeling absolutely nothing but cold contempt. I told her that my house was not a piggy bank for a criminal. Richard's face contorted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. He stomped across the hardwood floor, closing the distance between us until he was standing just inches from my face. He smelled like stale coffee and aggressive cologne. He pointed a thick, trembling finger right between my eyes and yelled that I was an ungrateful, unnatural daughter. He said that after everything they had done to raise me, I owed them this. I didn't back down. I looked him dead in the eye and told him he hadn't raised me. He had merely tolerated my presence while he worshipped Sabrina. I told him he lost the right to ask me for anything the night he threw me out into the cold 5 years ago. That was when he snapped. Richard reached out and grabbed my wrist. His grip was hard, tight, and meant to intimidate. It was a massive mistake. The second his hand closed around my arm, the adrenaline completely took over. I ripped my arm out of his grasp, took 2 massive steps backward, and pulled my cell phone out of my back pocket. I didn't hesitate. I dialed 911 and held my thumb hovering right over the call button. I looked at them both, my voice shaking with pure adrenaline, and told them that if they did not step outside my house in the next 3 seconds, I was pressing the button and pressing charges for assault and home invasion. The sight of the numbers on the screen finally pierced through their delusion. Richard backed away, raising his hands in a mocking gesture of surrender. Diane stopped crying instantly, her face hardening into a bitter skull. They walked toward the front door, but right before Richard stepped out, he turned back to look at me. His eyes were completely dark. He told me, in a low, venomous whisper, that I was going to pay for this. He said family always collects its debts, and I would regret treating them like strangers. Then he slammed my front door so hard the frame pictures on my hallway wall rattled against the paint. The moment their car pulled out of my driveway, my knees gave out. I sank down onto the floor of my entryway, my back pressed against the door, and I finally let myself cry. It wasn't a cry of sadness, it was a release of absolute, concentrated terror and exhaustion. My home, my beautiful sanctuary that I had poured my heart, my soul, and my life savings into, felt completely tainted. The air felt heavy. The walls felt like they were closing in. They knew where I lived. They had shown they were willing to use physical intimidation. They were desperate, and desperate people do not care about boundaries or logic. I sat on the floor and called Cameron. When he picked up, I was practically hyperventilating. I spilled everything that had just happened, my words tripping over each other in a frantic rush. Cameron didn't interrupt. He just listened, his steady breathing on the other end of the line grounding me. When I finally finished, there was a long pause. Then, his voice came through the speaker, calm, decisive, and entirely protective. He told me that I could not stay in that house anymore. He said it wasn't safe. He said I needed to pack a bag, get in my car, and drive to Colorado right now. I looked around at my beautiful house. The thought of leaving it made my chest ache. I told him I couldn't just abandon my property. I had a mortgage. I had furniture. I had a life here. Cameron was gentle but firm. He reminded me that it was just a building. My safety, my peace of mind, was worth infinitely more than wood and drywall. He suggested we look into selling it fast. Not putting it on the market, not hosting open houses where my parents could easily show up and cause a scene, but selling it to one of those corporate cash buyer investment firms. It was the most radical, terrifying, and brilliant idea I had ever heard. The next morning, I didn't log into work. I called an emergency personal day and started making frantic phone calls. I contacted a massive real estate investment firm that specialized in buying properties off-market for cash. They sent a local representative to my house that very afternoon. The representative did a quick walkthrough, noted the pristine condition of the property, and offered me a deal on the spot. Financially, it was a painful pill to swallow. They offered me about 10% below the actual market value of the home, which amounted to tens of thousands of dollars left on the table. But in exchange, they promised a 10-day closing period, all cash, no contingencies, and total confidentiality. I signed the preliminary paperwork right there on my kitchen island. The next 10 days were an absolute blur of frantic, secret activity. I felt like a spy operating behind enemy lines. I rented a large moving truck under Cameron's name. I packed up my entire life under the cover of darkness, taping boxes shut in the middle of the night so the neighbors wouldn't ask questions. I kept my blinds drawn tight and jumped every time a car drove past the house. On the 10th day, the funds cleared directly into my bank account. The house officially belonged to the corporate investment firm. I handed the keys to the property manager, climbed into the cab of the moving truck with my personal car hitched to the back, and I drove away. I drove for 2 days straight, fueled by gas station coffee and pure adrenaline. When I finally crossed the state line into Colorado and pulled into Cameron's driveway, he was waiting on the porch. The moment I stepped out of the truck and he wrapped his arms around me, a massive, physical weight lifted off my shoulders. I was exhausted, I had lost money, and I had lost my dream home, but as I stood there in the freezing mountain air, I realized something incredibly profound. I was free. They didn't know where I was. They couldn't find me. The ghosting protocol was complete. For weeks later, my life in Colorado felt like a completely different universe. Moving in with Cameron was supposed to be a stressful adjustment, but it was actually the easiest transition I had ever made. His house was a cozy, rustic place nestled near the foothills, surrounded by towering pine trees and absolute silence. Every morning, we would sit on the back porch with our coffee, watching the frost melt off the branches, and just talk. Living with someone who actually respected me, who viewed me as a partner rather than an ATM or a punching bag, was incredibly healing. I set up my new home office in a spare bedroom that looked out over the mountains. My remote job transferred seamlessly. We spent our evenings cooking dinner together, watching movies, and planning out a future that felt incredibly secure. For the first time in my entire 33 years of existence, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't bracing myself for an argument or a manipulative guilt trip. I was just happy. I hadn't heard a single whisper from my family. I had completely changed my phone number, deleted my old email accounts, and deactivated every piece of social media I owned. As far as the digital world was concerned, Valerie no longer existed. I assumed my parents had hit a dead end, realized I was gone, and were finally forced to deal with the catastrophic mess Sabrina had created on their own. I was wrong again. They hadn't given up. They had just been waiting for the right moment to strike. It was a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 1 month after I had fled my home. I was finishing up a coding project when Cameron's house phone rang. It was a landline he kept strictly for emergencies and local utility companies. He was out running errands, so I walked into the kitchen and picked it up. A deep, professional voice on the other end asked to speak with Valerie. My blood ran cold. Nobody knew I was here. I asked cautiously who was calling. The man introduced himself as Detective Hayes with the police department from my old city, the city I had just escaped. He stated his badge number and asked if I was the former owner of the property located at my old address. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, my mind spinning. I confirmed that I used to own the house, but had sold it a month ago. I asked him if something was wrong with the property, wondering if maybe there was an issue with the title transfer or a property tax dispute. Detective Hayes let out a heavy sigh that crackled over the phone line. He said there was nothing wrong with the paperwork. He said he was calling because my parents, Diane and Richard, were currently sitting in holding cells at his precinct. He said they had been arrested late last night on multiple felony charges, including breaking and entering and aggravated destruction of private property. I literally had to pull out a kitchen chair and sit down. The room started spinning. My parents? Arrested? Felonies? My father was a man who complained about people jaywalking because it violated the rules of society. My mother was obsessed with keeping up appearances at her country club. The idea of them sitting in a jail cell was so absurd it sounded like a bad joke. I asked Detective Hayes to slow down and explain exactly what happened and where they had broken into. The detective's next words completely shattered my reality. He told me they had broken into my old house, the house I had just sold to the corporate investment firm. And they hadn't just broken in to snoop around. They had gone in there with the deliberate, premeditated intention of destroying my entire life. As Detective Hayes read the details from the police report, my jaw slowly dropped, and a feeling of sheer, unadulterated horror washed over me, immediately followed by an overwhelming wave of karmic awe. He explained that my parents obviously had no idea I had sold the house and moved out of state. Because I had sold it privately, off-market, to a corporate entity, there were no for sale signs ever placed in the yard. There were no online listings. To anyone driving by, the house looked exactly the same, just empty of my car. They had stewed in their toxic rage for a month. Sabrina's deadline to pay back her stolen $300,000 was rapidly approaching, and in their twisted, entitled minds, they blamed me entirely for her impending downfall. Because I wouldn't willingly give them the money, they decided to enact a brutal, physical revenge. According to the detective, late on a Monday night, Richard and Diane drove to my old house. They parked their car a block away to avoid detection. They walked through the back alley, climbed over my wooden privacy fence, and approached the rear patio doors. They brought weapons. They were armed with heavy, metal baseball bats. Richard used his bat to completely shatter the sliding glass door. They stepped inside, fully believing they were standing in my sanctuary, and they went absolutely berserk. But here is the detail that makes this the most poetic instance of karma I have ever witnessed. When corporate investment firms buy a house for cash, they don't just sit on it. They immediately send in a massive team of contractors to renovate the property so they can flip it for a massive profit. Over the past 3 weeks, the firm had completely gutted and upgraded the interior. Detective Hayes read from the damage assessment. My parents walked into the newly renovated kitchen and used their metal baseball bats to smash the brand-new, custom-cut imported granite countertops into jagged pieces. They took the bats to the state-of-the-art stainless steel refrigerator, the double ovens, and the glass induction stove, denting and shattering everything in sight. They walked into the living room, carrying gallons of industrial bleach they had brought in a duffel bag, and poured it all over the newly installed, extremely expensive Brazilian hardwood floors. They shattered the custom bay windows. They punched holes in the drywall. They spray-painted vile, hateful words across the freshly painted walls, calling me a traitor and a greedy coward. They thought they were destroying my life. They thought they were taking away the precious sanctuary I cared about more than them. They were so consumed by their manic, destructive rage that they didn't hear the property manager pull into the driveway. The investment firm had installed a silent alarm system the week prior, and the break-in had triggered a direct alert to the manager's phone. He arrived, expecting to find teenagers vandalizing the site. Instead, he walked in on 2 seniors in their 60s, covered in sweat and drywall dust, wielding baseball bats like deranged lunatics. The property manager didn't try to stop them. He just locked the front door from the outside, walked back to his car, and called the police. When the officers arrived and drew their weapons, Richard actually tried to argue with them. He proudly confessed to the vandalism on police body cam footage. He told the officers that it was his daughter's house, that she deserved it, and that he had every right to teach her a lesson about family loyalty. It was only when the officers placed him in handcuffs and the property manager handed over the corporate ownership documents that the color completely drained from Richard's face. Detective Hayes told me the total estimated damage to the investment firm's property was over $50,000. Because the victims were a massive corporation rather than a private citizen, they were absolutely ruthless. The corporate lawyers were demanding the maximum criminal charges and full financial restitution. My parents were facing serious, life-altering felony convictions. I thanked the detective for the information, hung up the phone, and sat in the quiet Colorado kitchen for a very long time. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel guilty. I just felt a profound sense of awe at how the universe had perfectly orchestrated their own destruction. The news of the arrest spread through my old hometown like wildfire. 2 days later, my phone buzzed with a message on a secondary app one had forgotten to delete. It was from Monica, an old friend from high school who still lived in the area and thrived on local gossip. She had somehow gotten my new number through a mutual acquaintance and was practically vibrating with the need to share what she knew. I called her back and Monica unloaded the final, missing piece of the puzzle. The piece that proved just how deeply sinister my sister really was. Monica worked as a paralegal at a large law firm in the city. She told me that she had been following the rumors about Sabrina's massive financial collapse, so she did a little digging in the public court records out of sheer curiosity. She found the case files. Sabrina really was in debt for $300,000 due to her fraudulent investment scheme. But the rest of the story, the terrifying narrative she had spun to our parents, was a complete, calculated lie. There were no shadowy, violent investors. There were no loan sharks making threatening phone calls in the middle of the night. There was absolutely nobody threatening physical violence, driving past their apartment, or promising to break their legs. The people Sabrina had scammed were a group of boring, wealthy, retired dentists who had formed a legal investment group. When they realized Sabrina had stolen their money to buy her Mercedes and designer bags, they didn't send thugs. They sent lawyers. The dangerous threats Sabrina was facing were just standard legal summons and a civil lawsuit to freeze her assets and force her into bankruptcy. I listened to Monica explain this, and a chilling realization crept down my spine. Sabrina knew that a boring civil lawsuit wouldn't be enough to make our parents panic. She knew that if she just said she was being sued, Diane and Richard might help her, but they wouldn't cross the line into complete insanity. So, she fabricated a life-or-death scenario. She weaponized their parental protective instincts. She convinced them that she was going to be physically harmed or murdered by the mob, creating a state of absolute, blind panic. She gaslit our parents into a state of sheer terror, pointing them directly at me like a loaded gun, all because she didn't want to give up her luxury cars and face the embarrassing reality of bankruptcy court. She manipulated them into committing a violent felony just to save her own skin. She was a sociopath. A spoiled, entitled, incredibly dangerous sociopath. Monica told me that the truth about the investors had come out during my parents' bail hearing. The judge had asked to see police reports regarding the threats against their daughter to establish a motive for their unhinged behavior. When the defense attorney had to admit that the threats were completely fabricated by Sabrina, the judge was absolutely merciless. Hearing that Sabrina had orchestrated the entire catastrophe made the final outcome almost poetic. They had sacrificed their entire lives, their morals, and their freedom to protect a golden child who was perfectly willing to let them go to prison if it meant she could keep her designer lifestyle. I thanked Monica for the information and finally deleted that last remaining app. I had all the answers I needed. The story of my toxic family had reached its natural, inevitable conclusion, and I was entirely removed from the blast radius. The legal fallout from the break-in was swift, brutal, and entirely public. I didn't have to seek out the information. The local news cycle in my hometown covered the bizarre story of the elderly couple attacking a corporate-owned house with baseball bats. Facing the very real threat of spending their retirement years in a state penitentiary for felony vandalism and breaking and entering, Richard and Diane's defense attorney scrambled to make a plea deal. The corporate investment firm did not care about family drama, they only cared about their bottom line. They agreed to drop the push for maximum prison time on one strict, non-negotiable condition: full and immediate financial restitution. The court ordered my parents to pay $50,000 to cover the destroyed granite, the ruined floors, the shattered windows, and the labor costs. On top of that, they were hit with massive legal fees, court costs, and steep fines. The total bill came out to nearly $80,000. My parents were comfortably middle class, but they did not have $80,000 in liquid cash just sitting around. They had spent years subsidizing Sabrina's lavish lifestyle. To avoid going to prison, they had to make the ultimate sacrifice. They were forced to put their house, the large, comfortable suburban home I had grown up in, the home they had planned to retire in, the home they told me I wasn't welcome in, on the market. They had to sell it quickly in a fire sale, taking a massive loss on the property value just to get the cash in time to satisfy the court order. After paying off the corporate firm, the lawyers, and the fines, they had barely anything left. The meager equity that remained from the sale of their lifelong home was immediately handed over to Sabrina's legal team in a desperate attempt to settle her fraud case and keep her out of federal prison. The cosmic irony of it all was almost too perfect to believe. They had shown up at my door, demanding I sell my sanctuary to fix Sabrina's mistakes. When I refused, they tried to destroy my house. And as a direct result of that hateful action, they were forced to sell their own sanctuary to fix the exact same mistake. Karma didn't just knock on their door, it kicked it down and took the deed to the house. Today, Richard, Diane, Sabrina, and Trent are all living together. Without the massive house or the luxury cars, they were forced to rent a cramped, outdated two-bedroom apartment in a terrible part of town. For incredibly toxic, entitled adults, crammed into a tiny space, entirely broke, and forced to look at each other every single day, knowing exactly who was to blame for their misery. It is a prison of their own making, and it is exactly what they deserve. A few months after the dust settled, the flying monkeys attempted to breach my defenses one last time. Distant aunts and cousins managed to track down my new P.O. box and sent a flurry of letters. They wrote that Diane was depressed, that Richard was a broken man, and that they were constantly crying and begging for my forgiveness. The letters pleaded with me to be the bigger person, claiming that family is still family and that everyone makes mistakes in moments of desperation. I didn't even read them all. I skimmed the first one, laughed out loud in the post office parking lot, and threw the entire stack into the recycling bin. You do not accidentally hire a private investigator. You do not accidentally pack a duffel bag full of industrial bleach and metal baseball bats. You do not accidentally try to destroy your own daughter's life because you favor her sister. Those were not mistakes. Those were calculated choices made by malicious people. And I refuse to let malicious people back into my life just because we share some DNA. When I drove back to the house in the mountains that afternoon, Cameron was waiting for me in the kitchen. He had cooked my favorite meal, lit some candles, and there was a small, velvet box sitting on the center of the table. When he got down on one knee and asked me to marry him, I didn't hesitate for a single second. I said yes with my whole heart. As he slipped the ring onto my finger, I looked around our warm, peaceful home. I realized that the concept of family is not defined by bloodlines or obligation. True family is chosen. It is built on a foundation of mutual respect, unconditional support, and a love that doesn't come with a price tag or a hostage negotiation. I survived the people who were supposed to protect me, and I built an incredibly beautiful life in spite of them. Sometimes I look back at the chaotic mess they made of their own lives, all because they felt entitled to what I built with my own two hands. They expected me to set myself on fire to keep their golden child warm, and when I refused, they burned their own house down. Literally. I've built a beautiful life with Cameron, far away from their toxic reach, but a small, naive part of me sometimes wonders if I was too harsh to never look back. So, what do you think? Am I the jerk for letting my family destroy their own lives, or should I have tried to warn them before they walked right into their own karma? Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button to join our community and drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one of them.